Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa. I'm the Events and Outreach Specialist at MCR Labs. I want to thank you all for coming to our event today, The Evolving Cannabis Industry. We're going to kick things off with some presentations from MCR Labs Director of Business Development, Jonathan Wani, and our Director of Scientific Operations, Scott Churchill. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so make sure to throw your questions directly in the chat. After those conclude, we're going to take a quick break before jumping into our panel discussion featuring professionals from different segments in the industry, starting at 12 p.m. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to John Wani, our Director of Business Development. So take it away, John.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. And just a quick shout out to Melissa Kenton and Alexandra Gomes on the MCR marketing team for holding my hand and holding Scott's hand and making this quite painless on our end. So as Melissa alluded to, my name is John Wani. I'm the Director of Business Development at MCR Labs, and I'm going to focus on how our industry has changed since legalization and sort of my thoughts about where we're going to go in the future. So as I said, we are an industry in transition, and the first bit of this presentation is going to look at how things have changed. So right away, the major industry change that I see is frankly just the raw amount of producers. And while it's always great to see retail licenses and manufacturing licenses come online, they can't produce the product. And so by the fact that at the beginning of 2016, when there were only 3 medical marijuana producers vertically integrated, and now we fast forward to the end of last year, 2020, into this year, and we're at probably 80 plus now. So this is just a great sign in terms of the overall availability of product being out in the marketplace. And as we continue to go, and if you pay attention to how the CCC has been approving licenses, both indoor and outdoor cultivators, that number is only going to continue to increase. And the end result, the tangible benefit for the consumer is there will be more availability of product. In conjunction with the amount of producers increasing, what we've also seen is a shift away from vertically integrated medical marijuana businesses into much more of a product type specialization class. So individual license types give the ability for producers to pick a few things, maybe one thing that they do really well, and focus on that, as opposed to the vertically integrated businesses where they have to focus on the grow, the product manufacturing, which also includes, the laboratory, creating oils, distillates, concentrates, extracts, and then in the kitchen, using those oils to infuse a plethora of different sort of infused products. But as we continue to go with more producers coming online and more specialized licenses coming online, really it's going to benefit the consumer in the end. Now, some other industry changes that we have seen, and these might not be at the forefront for people if you're not in the industry, are the following two. And the first one really is the mandated seed-to-sale tracking systems that are being used in different states, so that there's sort of continuity in terms of how the state can track all the product, whether how much is being grown, how much is being transferred, how much is being wasted, how much is being sold. And what we had seen is if your operation does not take the seed-to-sale tracking software into account and develop a training protocol around that, it's really going to create obstacles within your operation. So it's one thing that if you have an internal seed-to-sale tracking system and everybody in your organization is fully trained up on that, you do need to take the extra step to be fully versed in whether it's BioTrack, MJ Freeway, or in our state of Massachusetts, Metric. And so we at MCR ourselves are developing internal training protocols and processes strictly on Metric, how to work within Metric and the various functions in there, because we found that the training for laboratories, for independent testing labs, really wasn't up to par, and we had to take it upon ourselves. And I think more operators are also going to have to do that to ensure operational efficiency. And the second point here, I guess you could have put this in the next group of slides, but really with brick and mortar will always exist in terms of retail. Someone will always be able to go to a physical location and shop, have personal interactions with people, and make their purchases that way. But really, the delivery licenses do have the potential to change how we purchase cannabis. You really just have to look at how the coronavirus pandemic has changed things in terms of, shopping from home, the ease of acquiring things that you would need, from groceries to, everything and anything in between that you need at home that you could get at the store. There probably is a means to get it via delivery. And so we'll see how things shake out, but really it could create a paradigm shift in terms of how consumers view buying and selecting and then purchasing cannabis. Now, with those major industry changes, we do have a sort of idea about where we're going to go in the future, and potential changes that might come down, on the horizon. Now, what we're seeing is a lot of times people try to relate the cannabis industry to other established industries just for analogous purposes. And so I often get asked this question in terms of where do I think cannabis is going down? What's the industry that it's most relatable to? And really, there are several, and the two main industries that I want to point out are the beer and food industry. So I'm going to take the food industry first, and it's a crude example, but if you wanted to buy a hamburger, you have multiple options on where to buy that hamburger. You could get a $2 burger at McDonald's. You could go and get a $5 to $7 burger at Five Guys, or you could go to a restaurant and get a $10 to $20 burger, sometimes even more expensive. The control is in the consumer's hands. You get to decide what you want to purchase. If the demand is not there for those products, then frankly, those businesses are not going to offer them. Now shifting from food over to beer, I think beer is the more appropriate relationship. Now, even though that myself, I don't drink, and I know a lot of people that consume cannabis and they do not drink, it is an appropriate sort of example in terms of where it could go, not where it will go. So the beer example, 90%, probably even more of the beer sold in this country is either sold by Bud, Coors, or Miller. And those operators, those entities are not really concerned so much with the other side of it, which is craft. And in between craft, we have and this is my term, semi-craft. And you can lump in there maybe Sam Adams. It definitely wouldn't be mass market produced, but you could get it anywhere. It is widely available, and the quality, at least perceptionally, is seen as a bit higher than your Bud Light or your Miller Lite or your Coors or something like that. The next level really, though, is craft. And so when I tell this to my friends, especially the ones who drink craft beer, they get it very quickly. Treehouse, Trillium, The Alchemist, Farmstead or Farmstead Hill, I forgot the name, up in Vermont. These breweries don't necessarily care about what Budweiser is doing, and the opposite is true. Budweiser and Coors don't really care what they're doing. But there's a reason why if you drive through Charlton in the summertime on a Thursday, there's going to be a line out on Southwest Cutoff, Route 20, because people are lining up in droves to get that Treehouse beer, okay? And so the demand will always be there for the exceptional quality product. And then everything in between, because for most people, the mass market produced cannabis is going to be appropriate. That's what they're looking for. But there should be levels in terms of what you want and the quality of what you're purchasing. And again, going back to one of my earlier slides, the more product that is produced will allow that to come to fruition. A second big change that I think will happen is really going back to the individual license types, and then having people do what they do best and focus on that. So we've seen quite a surge in seltzers recently. And again, if you want to look back at the alcohol industry, seltzers were extremely popular for the past 2 to 3 years. It exploded with popularity, where now almost every beer manufacturer is trying to get a seltzer out on the market. And what we've seen is that there are people who have worked with these things or emulsions in the past, and an emulsion is basically how do we get water and oil to combine and remain in suspension, basically remain mixed together. And the seltzer is a really good example because obviously, low carb, low dose, easy to use, non-intimidating. Right now, there are people sitting in a lab, in a kitchen, in an office, trying to figure out what they can put cannabis into next. And so really it's a great time in terms of innovation and creativity. And I think, we'll see more and more unique products come down the line. And then finally, vapes. So 2019 was when a lot of the media was picking up stories about people becoming ill by ingesting vapes and having these sort of injuries that were being described as chemical burns. Our state moved very quickly. We started testing for vitamin E acetate. My colleague Scott Churchill, who will be presenting right after me, developed a screen with his team in about 10 days. And then we offered it for free to any other lab who wanted to also use that method. What happened since then, though, is a market change in terms of the vape manufacturers and the quality of the hardware. So more and more states are coming online with either medical or adult use recreational programs are requiring heavy metals. It's one of the more novel tests in the cannabis industry. And so as a result of that, these manufacturers are cognizant of the fact that they have to make sure that their hardware is clean. And if it's not clean, then it's going to come back on them. Because frankly, word's going to get around that, oh no, you can't buy X cartridge from this manufacturer because you might fail for lead. This is leading to a higher quality product. And in the end, again, this is going to be a tangible benefit for the consumer because they don't really have to jeopardize their health in terms of playing Russian roulette and trying to pick a cart that might not have some lead in it and get them sick. And so those are things that we myself personally think will happen in the future. Now, regulatory changes are always something that's a hot topic button. I'm sure we're going to touch on those during the panel discussion. But I think what we need to look at is how medical is treated versus adult use recreational. And so the way that I think about it and the way that my colleagues at MCR think about it, the medical industry, or the medical program in any state, the goal should be that the most vulnerable individual who could consume that medical cannabis is protected. And what that means is we need to have a lot of broad range tests so we could possibly capture anything and everything that could make that person ill or exacerbate any issues that they might currently have. So extremely stringent testing limits and a combo of broad and targeted screens. We want to make sure that we can capture as many of the molds as possible, but we also definitely want to make sure that E. coli and Salmonella are not in these products. For adult use, and I think we're going to see this more and more, California is a great example of it, they're treating it more as an agricultural crop. And it should have targeted screens with a bit higher limits. And really what that does, it passes the onus back on the producer to have a higher quality system in terms of what products they're comfortable with releasing to market. And it also puts a little bit more pressure on the consumer to make informed, conscious decisions when they're buying things. So if you're at the point of sale and if you see a batch and you're not sure of that batch just by the looks of it, you don't have to buy it. And that will correct itself throughout the market. If word gets around that a producer is not drying their product out properly, and then some batches are getting moldy down the line, even though they passed the initial round of testing, again, it's got to fall back on the producer and also the consumer to take responsibility for that product. And things are going to become tainted over time. It happens all the time with our food when we bring it home from the supermarket. And so if we can change the way we look at adult use medical, or in terms of adult use recreational products, I think that'll allow the industry to actually grow quickly and not be hampered and held back. Now, finally, this is something that's very important to me because when the recreational laws were passed, we were one of the states that said, yes, adults should be able to cultivate cannabis as long as they follow the rules set out by the Cannabis Control Commission. And that's basically don't grow it in an accessible area, have it under lock and key, so on and so forth. But really, what is changing and what will change in the future are just, frankly, information. There's more resources for people to learn more. So there's always been forums, message boards, books, and magazines. YouTube, though, has exploded with popularity, and really the internet in general. Now, it's a double-edged sword because there is a lot of misinformation or poorly instructed information out there, but there are resources to point you in the right direction, MCR being one of them. In addition, with the resources, we also have a lot more grow stores that are opening up all over the place and a lot more business to consumer companies that are popping up. And this allows and gives more access to the people at home who do have the means to grow for themselves in terms of lighting, tents, irrigation, fertilizers, IPM, harvest tools, so on and so forth. Anything that has to do with cultivation, there's just more of it available and it's easier to access. Amazon's the best example. Anything that you need to grow indoors or even outdoors, you could probably get it on Amazon. Or your local grow store is who you should be going to. And then in conjunction with that, as we progress, every day that goes by is another day that legal or medical cannabis has existed. And when more and more people actually become educated about it or see what it is, and more importantly, what it doesn't do and what it is not, that's going to lead to more acceptance from society in general. And frankly, growing cannabis, if you've never done it before, we strongly recommend anybody who has the means to do so, not just for the end result, the tangible product, but so that you can learn, you can begin to understand more about the plant, its own physiology, how it grows, how it reacts to different variables, and it'll give you a better appreciation for cultivation in general, and it'll make you more conscientious consumer of cannabis. With that being said, I'm all wrapped up. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Scott Churchill, who's going to talk about some advances in cannabis science.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, John. My name is Scott Churchill. I work in the science department, and John and I have been with MCR since the very beginning. And like John, I'm going to briefly talk about where we were back then and where we are now and where we think we're going. Back in 2013, we had pretty humble beginnings. As you can see by this picture, we were using tequila bottles for our mobile phase reservoirs. And, we only had one scientist, essentially. Mike and I were both scientists, but, we had to share our time doing other duties because, we were just the two of us. And we only had one test. We tested for 5 cannabinoids, and that's where we began. At the time, it wasn't even possible to access certified reference material, what we used to basically calibrate instruments for more than those targets. So it was very challenging in the beginning when there was no industry. It was just kind of a fresh start. But that's also part of the reason that I joined, was because there was so much opportunity to create the science. We now have 11 tests that measure 93 targets: cannabinoids, terpenes, heavy metals, microbes, toxins, moisture content, and water activity. We have a team of 6 chemists, 3 microbiologists, an instrument maintenance specialist, a metrology specialist, and a department manager. They're focused on making sure that the lab keeps running and that MCR stays at the forefront of cannabis science. We really have come a long way. Some of our more recent innovations include offerings in microbiology and new technologies on the chemistry side. We now offer speciation services to our clients. This means that if you have positive hits for microbiology, we can identify what the most predominant species is in that microbiological failure, and then that allows the growers to tailor their remediation efforts to give them the best chance for success in protecting their grow. We also offer a viroid screen, which allows clients to not only protect their grow from incoming infected clones, it also allows them to track and remediate any outbreaks that they might have in their own grow. This results in higher yield and better chemical profiles in terms of cannabinoids and terpenes. We have begun an environmental monitoring program to control our own microbiological processes, but we can also apply it proactively at grows and processing facilities to prevent microbial infestations, as well as to assist our clients in remediating any kind of outbreaks they might have. The On the chemistry side, we have higher pressure systems and mass spec detectors that allow us to develop new methodologies, looking for more targets, and even doing some untargeted searches where we collect spectra, we compare it to a library, and then we're able to determine unknown things so that we don't actually need the certified reference material or know that it's there to look for it. We just scan the entire thing and we were able to find that. Our current research and development efforts focus on improving and expanding our existing testing capabilities, exploring and leveraging new analytical technologies, and conducting research that's of interest to the community. Over the years, we've done a number of experiments and projects. We've researched how long it takes cannabinoids in vaporized flower to diminish, the difference between cannabinoid content between stems and flowers, what's the cannabinoid content of resin or reclaim, many other projects. We continue to do this research, and over the years, we've collaborated with a number of external partners as well. We were involved in a study evaluating the cognitive impact of medical cannabis on the consumer. We worked with Brandeis and Skell Labs to identify and characterize the crystalline structure of THCA. We work with SciEx on a number of projects, including one that I really liked was the comparison of an indoor grow to an outdoor grow, where we had the same strain grown indoors and outdoors, and then we did an untargeted search of all of the chemical constituents and did a comparison. Right now, we're currently working on an untargeted analysis of vaporizer carts. That's essentially where you're looking for what no one's looking for. So it'll be interesting to find out what we find in there. And we're in the early stages of collaborating with a company called bioMérieux on developing cannabis-specific pathogen detection technology that'll help better quality and better yielding grows. To learn more and access our research, you can go to mcrlabs.com, Cannabis Science, and click on the Knowledge Hub. That's where you'll find our completed projects and a number of other resources. So what's the future hold? Tomorrow really never knows. So we're just kind of speculating here, but the industry is maturing. Regulators and accreditation boards are learning, and in some cases adapting their approaches in an attempt to improve the consistency and quality of data. Professional associations have also begun crafting guidances and method performance criteria to try and standardize and improve the quality and integrity of laboratory data. It's inevitable that laboratories who have insufficient quality controls and integrity of science will not be able to survive in the future market. It will not allow for poor quality or questionable performance. Having tested so many unique cannabis samples, we have accumulated a considerable amount of data on potencies, profiles, and contaminants. I believe this data will support research and regulators alike. This data can inform regulatory guidances and medical discovery. We currently have at MCR a team of data scientists looking for whether we can create predictive modeling that would allow us to prevent heavy metal failures or microbiological outbreaks in our clients' grows before they happen. There are likely applications that haven't even been thought of yet for the amount of data that we have. In summary, I anticipate a cannabis future that has no place for poor quality labs, or labs with questionable behavior. This may take some time as regulatory bodies continue to learn and develop their understanding of the science we do. I see laboratories as being a resource beyond issuing compliance certificates. I see laboratories leveraging their science into the production and improvement of grows and processes. I see labs collaborating with other public health stewards to stay on top of and ahead of potential risks to public health. Finally, I see us having a better understanding of the cannabis plant and how to get the most benefit we can from it. Thank you for listening. I'm going to turn things over to Melissa for questions before we move on to the panel.
Thank you, John and Scott, for those very insightful presentations. As you said, Scott, now is the time for questions. So feel free to throw any questions you guys have directly into the chat there. If you had accidentally minimized your chat or made it smaller to make the presentations bigger, you can re-enable that by clicking the bottom right-hand corner where it says chat. Now, while you guys are inserting your questions in the chat, I do have one for you, Scott, actually. What are some of the experiments that you hope to do in the future?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, but right now we have just begun, we just recently added a new technology that allows us to do untargeted searches. So I'm looking forward to kind of looking at a number of flower samples and concentrate samples in an untargeted search and compare it to libraries and start to see what it is that is showing up in these plants. I'm very curious about the phytochemicals that are in there.
Very interesting.
And Melissa, if I could just add on to that, the question that I typically receive quite often, especially early on when we started, was, well, what else is in there, right? And it's been a topic of discussion. It's extremely difficult to do when you don't know what you're looking for. So, like Scott said, we are listening to our clients. We're trying to develop assays and tests that will ultimately lead to more value to them and that will help their processes overall.
Very interesting. John, one question for you that I see here is, can you name any of those forums or magazines that would be good resources that you touched on in an earlier slide? Sure.
So there's a lot of older grow forums. IC Mag is one of them, the Overgrown forums. Instagram, honestly, has probably taken over a large part of that forum sort of community. Facebook does have some groups in there that you can find, but really it's the big ones. I see Mag, and the Overgrown forums. Magazines, while print media is sort of, has been slowly dying over the last, let's just say 10, 15 years. High Times is still out there. And there are more and more that are actually popping up that are regional, right? So there's one that Danny Danko started after he had left High Times last year. I believe it's Northeast Cannabis or something along those lines. But just ask around. If you want to reach out to me personally, I can do a little bit more digging and find you some better resources.
Awesome, thanks. Another question here is, how are consumers made aware of the testing taking place to ensure public safety?
That's an excellent question. I don't know if it's broadcast necessarily widely by the dispensaries. I think that a lot of people, when they consume, are assuming that we're going to buy this, if it's available for sale, that it's safe, right? The one thing, alluding back to one of my slides in terms of the vaporizer products, it's actually written into the regulations that every single dispensary, if they sell any vape products, that they have to have the certificates of analysis on hand and available on request by any consumer who wants to see them. Okay. Frankly, I think this should be the case for all products, not just vapes. It'll allow the consumers to make a more informed and conscientious decision. But again, if you ask for test data or test results and operator is unwilling to give them to you or share them with you, that for me would act as a red flag.
Thanks, John. Another question from the chat here from Carolyn. How do you see the speed of testing turnaround increasing in the future? Scott, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that as technology becomes available and is developed, that you should expect to see the actual time it takes to do an analysis go down. So if you're looking at what we currently do, we should be able to do report more targets, more cannabinoids, more terpenes in less time. And overall, with those shorter cycle times for the analysis, you should have a shorter overall turnaround time from receiving sample to getting a test report.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that, the big test that for us that's the limiting factor is our microbial assay or test, which for the yeast and mold portion of it, it requires 72 hours of incubation. So right there, we don't have a lot of wiggle room to expedite that timing. But I know that Scott and his team are always looking at how can we shave some time off of each individual test while not sacrificing on any accuracy, actually making the screen better, more reliable, with more sensitivity. But I think, again, going back to my slides in terms of adult use versus medical, if we were to have a targeted pathogen list for microbiological testing for the adult use product, that would not take 72 hours of incubation. So theoretically, you could develop a microbiome screen for targeted analysis that would not need to take 72 hours. But again, we have to consider that a full flower in Massachusetts that's sold at retail needs cannabinoids, microbiological, mycotoxins, heavy metals, and pesticides to be run on every batch, and all of those safety screens have to pass. So just something else to consider there.
Another question for Scott. Is there any required testing that you think is unnecessary? Are there tests that aren't required that you think would benefit the industry?
Well, I usually leave public health professionals to make those determinations. But based on what I've seen so far, we have not seen mycotoxins, the 4 subunits of aflatoxin and ochratoxin that we test for, 5 total toxins. We haven't seen a sample that's tested positive for it. Something they're doing in Maine is they're saying you don't need to test for those toxins unless you detect yeast and mold on the product. I think that makes sense. And I think that over time, the data that we've accumulated, the observations we've made, should be incorporated into a periodic revisiting of our regulations by public health experts, so that we can make sure that what we're doing is appropriate for the industry.
Thanks, Scott. We have a follow-up question to the one you answered earlier, John, about how are consumers made aware of the testing to the public? This response is, should legislation demanding that the certificates be displayed at dispensaries the way the licenses are displayed at liquor stores? As a consumer, this confirmed for me that the products are purchasing have been properly, I'm assuming properly tested would be the end of that question.
Okay, so I understand the question. At a liquor store, you're going to go and you're going to see something that says the liquor board has approved this business to stay open, right? To conduct their business. But you're not going to be able to find a certificate of analysis from Grey Goose confirming that the alcohol content in there or the proof is actually what it is, right? You're going to trust that the producer, whoever makes Grey Goose, is going to make a product that is consistent and it's not going to vary up and down, right? What I think the question is really alluding to more so is, if the CCC were to just make a simple change and say that all products available for sale must have an associated COA on hand to be produced upon request, right? So they have it right now for vape products, and I don't really see why they couldn't do it for all products. Again, I'm very conscious of all of our dispensary clients. This will create more work on the front end for their, sales associates, bud tenders, whatever you would like to call them. But again, if it leads to more transparency and a higher level of understanding and education from the consumer standpoint, then that's something that we would back.
Thanks, John. We have another question I think would be good for you. Do you see any change of regulations for testing indoor and outdoor grows? Outdoor grows not being able to pass certain tests is the issue there.
So this is being currently discussed with the commission right now. I don't know how much I can actually talk about it and how much they want the public to know what's actually being discussed. Frankly, I think that instead of outdoor versus indoor, it should be adult use versus medical. And if we make that line, we're not creating a system where basically every indoor cultivator is going to look at resent with the outdoor cultivators if there's a separate, set of rules for the outdoor cultivators. These indoor cultivators have had to spend, millions, if not tens of millions of dollars on their facility. And to set up a system which actually makes it tougher for them to get their products to retail, I just don't see how they're going to allow that to happen. They got a lot of money. They have a lot of lobbying power. They have a lot of people at the state level that will listen to their concerns. So I think the more common sense approach is, let's just look at all of adult use as the same, regardless of it's indoor or outdoor. Let's come up with a list of tests that makes sense for everyone, and then just go with that.
Great, thanks. One other response is, couldn't you use QR codes for identifying a certificate of analysis?
You could. A QR code, though, can be generated from any URL. We've had discussions with a couple of clients. There are operators in the state right now that when they get a COA from us, they upload to a portal. They will create a QR code based off of that COA in their portal, and then they'll attach that QR code on their packaging. So when you scan the QR, it's going to go straight to the certificate of analysis. That's more than okay. You don't need to have the physical actual COA on hand. As long as it's available and you can match it up with the appropriate batch, yes, absolutely. Again, more transparency. So QR codes would be able to cut through there as well. We offer the ability for any client that uses us, both public clients who just walk in and for the licensed operators in the state, for us to house their data in a public manner. But frankly, I don't think we have any dispensaries who take us up on that.
Great. One more for you, Scott. What changes or improvements to the lab have had the biggest impact on operations, in your opinion?
Wow, that's it. For me, it's been such a long and slow incremental that I could name off, a number for each year that we've been doing this. But two things that are really good on the chemistry side is now we have higher pressure instruments, so we're able to identify and measure more cannabinoids in less time, which is very exciting. And on the mass GC side, we have the same thing going on with a GC mass spec as compared to the FID. But I would say the best thing about the department is we now have a large team of scientists, and they're all very sharp and they're all very hardworking. And one thing that distinguishes us too is we have 3 microbiologists on staff, so that's very helpful, and they're doing a very good job for us.
Very exciting things going on in PsyOps, that's for sure. One more for you, Scott, actually. So do you have any predictions for tests or analytes that MCR may test for in the future?
I do believe that the untargeted search, where we basically get an expanded profile that includes more terpenes, more cannabinoids, and more phytochemicals that aren't even being discussed right now, as an expanded profile of the cocktail that's actually in the plant itself. I think that'll become very popular once we have it developed.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Does anybody else have any more questions in the chat? Otherwise, we will wrap things up here. If you guys do have any further questions after today that you didn't get a chance to ask, you can reach out to John and Scott directly with their emails right there on the screen. You can also just email us at hello@mcrlabs.com and we can put you in contact with them. So if there are no more questions, we're going to take a quick break now, and then we're going to rejoin here at 12 p.m. for our panel discussion. Thank you, John and Scott, for being here and answering your questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Oh, wait. Do you want
one more question?
You want me to answer that one?
Please do.
Growers that are unhappy with test results. The least favorite part of my job is having to discuss failures with clients. Some clients, from an operational standpoint, do not want to have the conversation in terms of what could have potentially caused this failure. They're honestly just looking for a pass. As Scott said, we have worked since our inception to be a partner with all of our clients. And when I say client, I mean someone who brings one sample for cannabinoids versus a client that does, 500 samples a month. We try to treat them the same. We try to give them the same attention to detail and respect that they deserve. How do I handle it? I try to gauge their receptiveness to doing an investigation in terms of how could these results have happened. And then we can honestly go back and objectively look at data, set up some experiments, and then try to not use opinion, try to use objective data to form that sort of investigation. And then once we've acquired an appropriate amount of data and have some findings, then we can continue the conversation. But obviously, failing a sample is not ideal. It does happen often, and it's the operators who truly care about the product and the processes that they have, who are willing to work with us, fix their issues, and then not have to worry about, widespread failures here and there. They will pop up from time to time, but it's the ability of the operator to quickly react and mitigate anything from either spreading or becoming worse. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you for taking that last one, John. Much appreciated. All right, now without further ado, we are going to take a quick break and we will meet back here at 12 p.m. for our panel discussion. See you all soon. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are about to kick off our panel discussion. Please feel free to throw any of the questions that you guys have for the panelists directly into the chat, and we will make sure to get them answered for you. Grant Smith Ellis, president of the Massachusetts Cannabis Reform Coalition, is going to be our moderator today. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand things off to you, Grant, to welcome our incredible panelists and get started.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you to everyone at MCR for hosting today's panel, Jonathan, Scott, and everyone else involved. The panelists that we have with us today are really, truly an excellent array of voices and perspectives from the local cannabis arena. And while I will quickly run through their names and give an introduction, I will pass it off to each panelist for a short intro before we begin our questions. We have with us today Shanel Lindsay, the founder and CEO of Ardent Life, Dr. Jill Becker, the attending physician at InhaleMD, Jessica Bartlett, reporter and journalist with the Boston Business Journal, Noni Goldman, the COO of The Hubcraft, and Jonathan Wani, the Director of Business Development at MCR Labs, who I think some of you were introduced to earlier today. So going around in a circle, based on what I see on my screen, we'll start with Shanel and then go to Jessica, Jonathan, and Noni for an introduction.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Shanel Lindsay. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Shanel Lindsay. I'm an attorney. I'm a business owner and an activist. My company is called Ardent, and with the help of MCR Labs, way back in the day, I developed a machine that allows people to make all kinds of cannabis products in their own home. So I've been growing that business for 6 years. I'm also a cannabis activist. I helped to write Question 4 and was a spokesperson for the campaign. I've been on the advisory board for the last 4 years now, and just so excited about being here to talk to everybody about the evolution of cannabis here in Massachusetts and all of the wonderful things that are to come here in this industry.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Bartlett. I'm a reporter for the Boston Business Journal. I cover a wide variety of things, including healthcare, cannabis, and craft beer. And have been covering the the cannabis industry for the last 7 years. So have seen a lot of evolution in that time. Thank you for having me today and looking forward to the discussion.
Sorry there, Grant, my mic's a little wonky. If you missed the first portion of this, my name is John Wani. I'm the Director of Business Development at MCR Labs. I started working here in the middle of 2014, where right around the time I met Shanel. I am focused on the sales aspects and also the client relationships that MCR has with all of our clients. And I just want to say I'm extremely honored and humbled to be a part of this group. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So thanks again.
Noni or Jill, please go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in. Hi, my name is Jill Becker. I am a physician at InhaleMD along with Dr. Jordan Tischler. My background is in medicine, obviously. I also hold a master's degree in psychology, expressive arts, and counseling. I'm an accidental partner in a restaurant. I hate to cook, not sure how that happened, but there I am.
Hi, I'm Noni Goldman. I'm COO of The Hubcraft. We're provisionally licensed for cultivation, manufacturing, and dispensary in Fitchburg and in Holyoke. I have a separate consulting company called Four Trees Management. We teach the cultivation curriculum for the Social Equity Program in partnership with the CCC. And I'm also the chairwoman of the Cultivation Committee of the NCIA.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for that introduction, and I was so excited to introduce the panelists. I forgot to introduce myself, although Melissa did give a quick introduction. My name is Grant Smith Ellis. I'm a disabled and homebound medical cannabis patient, and I'm also involved with various activism organizations, including the Massachusetts Cannabis Reform Coalition and a few other organizations. I was a graduate student before I fell disabled, and my interest was in developing a quantitative methodology to examine the cogency of public discourse as an indicator of political legitimacy in liberal republics, something I now get to do actively every day by way of my activism. So I do want to transition right into what is the theme of today's panel, which is the changes that have happened in the cannabis industry over the past few years in Massachusetts. And Shanel, it is fun to start with you because, as you mentioned, you were one of the folks who helped write the Question 4 law in Massachusetts. And my question is, there have been a lot of developments, legislative, regulatory, and otherwise, over the past 4 years. What has surprised you most, and where do you see us going in the future?
So I think that what has surprised me most, believe it or not, is how much we're still dragging our feet, I would say. I think that when we first passed the law, the idea was that things would be happening very quickly. And, within 4 years or so, we have this incredibly developed market. And we all know that things stalled out for just about that amount of time, when it came down to really things, coming to fruition there. So I would say that was one thing that was a little surprising, because I think I used to be an eternal optimist about, how quickly things could go. But I am, really excited and proud of what has happened. And I think, the biggest, change as far as I have seen is just really now the fast pace. Now that the delay in the beginning was horrible, but now I think we're really off to the races as far as how many people are coming into this industry. And I also think that it's important. Sorry about that. I look at it in kind of two different ways, like the industry side of things, which is obviously kind of what we hear about most, what we hear about most in the papers and who's opening up, and all of that's very exciting. But there's also the other part of the industry, which is really kind of how people personally have changed and are dealing with cannabis. And that's the surprising part that makes me happy, which is that there are folks that I know, and I'm sure everybody on this call feels the same way. People you never would have thought would be interested in cannabis all of a sudden are talking about terpenes or bringing up, something that is, that you kind of consider like, wow, people are not only, taking to this, but they're really, really getting, absorbed in this kind of new culture that's coming about. And for me, that's the most exciting piece of it all, and a little bit surprising too, because, sometimes you wonder whether or not we are in our own little bubble when it comes to cannabis. And when you see really this adoption, and then how that begins to spread into other states as well, that becomes really, really exciting.
Yes, I'd like to open the floor to anyone else on that same issue. What surprised any of our panelists? What surprised you the most over the past few years, and how did that surprise translate into your shifting perspective on the rollout of adult use cannabis?
If I could go real quick. I'm sorry, Jessica.
No, go ahead.
I want to echo Shanel's sentiments about as we progress. I interact with so many people who right off the bat, I wouldn't think that they would be receptive to cannabis. And then you have discussions with them, and Dr. Becker might be able to expand on this more, but especially for people who are on several different medications that could effectively reduce that number down to as close to zero as possible by consuming cannabis in a responsible manner. The other thing, Grant, and I know that this is something that you've spoken about, and Jessica will probably touch on this as well, the fact that we still have this process of acquiring a community host agreement and going through that process with these individual municipalities, the fact that this still exists and that the commission hasn't taken over to sort of regulate that process has been confounding to me. And what we've seen recently is Northampton and basically the mayor of Northampton saying, we're not going to charge these fees anymore because frankly, we're not seeing the impact, the detrimental impact that was, spoken about initially when the law was passed. So hopefully there's a more common sense approach taken in terms of how the state looks at these municipalities who frankly sometimes feel like they can extort these operators, and the operators are left with a situation where if they don't agree to what the municipality wants, sorry, you're not going to set up shop here. So that's been surprising to me how long it's taken to have a more sensible approach to this. We should allow people to open up businesses and let the market dictate whether or not they're successful or not.
Yeah, and building off that point, I think what has been, or at least what I've seen the evolution of the industry is some more acceptance from municipal leaders, from state leaders about cannabis. I mean, that we've seen dozens upon dozens of stores open in Massachusetts and the sky didn't fall. And I think that that's leading to some more comfort. But to Jonathan's point, we still have a host community agreement process. The legislature still hasn't taken action to give the CCC authority to review them. And so it's still an impediment. But I am seeing, at least over the 7 years I've been writing about cannabis, more acceptance than was previously. I think that's a testament to how far back we started, that we've come so far and still have so far to go, but at least we're moving in the right direction.
In terms of acceptance, I'm sorry, did I speak over somebody, Noni?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. In terms of acceptance, I have found that educating patients, and I always ask patients to bring family members if they'd like to, and I meet with family members separately if they'd like, and going through the educational process, teaching patients about cannabis, how it can be beneficial for them. To Jonathan's point, replaces a lot of medications. I've had patients say to me, oh my goodness, this is a miracle. Why didn't I start this 5 years ago? And to that point, it's very important to educate the patients so that they can then not feel the stigma, which is unfortunately still associated with cannabis or marijuana in that case, so that they can then get their medication. And I'll try not to be on too much of a soapbox because I could talk about this for days. But the fact that, a patient cannot go from one legal state to another legal state and crossing a state line with their medicine, however, they can take guns, alcohol, buy them both together and cross state lines is still ridiculous. But I'll leave that there for another day.
I just wanted to add, so Northampton got a lot of great press about them rescinding their community impact fee. Holyoke as well is also very receptive to the industry. That's right next door neighbor to Northampton. I think also with the maturity of the industry, we're seeing people who are early adopters early supporters, early adopters go into real positions of power. Aaron Vega is the new director of the Office of Economic Planning and Development of Holyoke. He's already made it his mandate to really support Holyoke's budding cannabis industry. And social equity and economic empowerment applicants also don't have to pay that community impact fee. So I think municipalities, the ones that really supported it, are just getting frustrated with the lack of direction from the CCC level, and they're taking it upon themselves to make it right.
Yes, so true. And I won't leave this issue on a negative, but it is important to point out that there are some communities, I won't mention any in particular, who have done the opposite and actually have attempted to suggest that rises in things such as youth consumption or domestic violence have been attributed to cannabis shops as an attempt to justify HCAs, which were not enumerated. And there's actually a lawsuit filed by a local I don't know if it's an economic empowerment or social equity company in Haverhill on just that issue. And I will also note for those paying close attention to the HCA issue, we should have some clarity on this when the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts hands down its ruling in Mediri versus Salem. Oral arguments were held last month. Those who may have seen the oral arguments may want to comment on how interesting it was to hear the Supreme Judicial Court justices weighing in on this very issue. So Jessica, John, anyone, please.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to, sorry, go ahead.
Please, Jessica, go.
No, it'll be interesting to see what the judge says on this, how far reaching their determination will be. I still think it'll take some kind of legislative change to move the needle on this. Even if a court says that the HCAs are not kind of the end all be all document, I think it'll still take further action, unfortunately.
And I'm sorry, Jessica, to step on your toes there. I agree with you, and I do think it's going to take legislative sort of authority to change this. And the one thing, Grant, that I want to bring up is what's interesting. If someone goes to a municipality and they want to set up a business and they're going through the negotiations with them, let's say that the municipality comes back and says, in addition to your 3% impact fee, we're going to also ask for you to pay this extra. Right? And we can call it whatever we want to call it to get around the max 3%, right? The operator is going to be forced to make a decision on whether to accept or maybe go find another municipality. If they accept, what I have seen, what a couple of colleagues have seen is when it gets to the CCC might actually interpret that extra payment as the operator trying to get the goodwill of the municipality. And it's actually not that case, right? They're basically in a negotiation, and the city or the town or whatever that can say, okay, this is what we want. You don't want to pay us, we'll find someone else. And if you agree to it, now you go to the state, and during your application, it's going to be looked at negatively and implied that the operator was the one who pushed that forward, right? So again, there needs to be a little bit more, like Noni alluded to, more onus on the CCC to make common sense approaches and decisions in terms of reviewing these HCAs. So.
Oh, common sense. Like if we could just insert common sense into everything that was happening here in the cannabis industry, what an amazing position we would be in. But it definitely felt great to hear from the justices just the same kind of quizzical, like, what is happening here, that I think everybody in the industry had been feeling. It was also amazing to just see the new composition and changes on the SJC in Massachusetts. As an attorney, it really warms my heart to see the progression that I have had there. So I was really proud of the sentiments that were being thrown around.
I don't mean to make you put your attorney hat on, Shanel, but in the context of change, can you take us through this? 2017, there's a vote as to whether the CCC has the authority to enforce host community agreements. Only one commissioner, I believe we both may know her. Her name is Shalene Title, voted that the CCC had that authority. The other four at the time voted against that. How did we get from there to where we're at with this Supreme Judicial Court case?
Yeah, so there, after the commission made the decision as the commission to, decide that they didn't have the authority to do that, it really kind of set in motion, right? The only thing that was left was for a lawsuit to be pursued around the issue. And I think it's really interesting when you look at from a legal perspective, especially when you have something like a ballot initiative, right? Which is how cannabis became legal in Massachusetts. There are just so many different things that can go wrong in a ballot initiative, right? And when I say go wrong, it's you have a group of attorneys, but people writing a law that has certain parameters things that you can and can't do. And you're also don't have the benefit of an entire legislature working together to push something to get forward that would have everybody's eyes on it in the way to tweak and understand and and predict as best as you can, right? As we know, laws are always, being tweaked and changed. But I think what happened here is you had something that I don't really think was ambiguous. I think that it's really clear that the CCC has the ability to oversee these. But when you get to a point where you have a regulatory authority like the CCC that now has to interpret, law that, yes, went through the legislature, but came from initial ballot initiative. And when you have commissioners, frankly, who didn't have the courage to stand up and say, yes, this is actually a real, honestly, the most central part of our job, really the only thing left is to appeal to the court to say, is this actually true, right? Do you need to have, does the law as written give the authority to the commission to do this? Or is there some gap that then needs to be addressed at the legislature? So we know that the legislature can go and change things as they want to. They haven't taken that. There are bills pending that would address this. And so that's something that folks should be, aware of. But I do think that at the end of the day, that is how we ended up here, hashing it out between the court and the legislature and a commission that didn't, doesn't have the appetite to take this on their own, even though I think that they would have been very successful. And I think that just goes to the fact that, when you have these new agencies and people trying to figure out where their power lies, and you have very powerful organizations like the Mass Municipal Association that are pushing back and saying, no, we can do whatever we want. It's like a perfect law school, exam question or, class project, because this is, it's all being made. We're watching history be made when it comes down to how this industry and how these rules will be implemented.
And if I could add a point to that, this issue is going to keep happening. I mean, you have municipalities that have a cap on the number of licenses they want in their town. And so the question of, is the HCA the mechanism municipalities have to pick and choose winners and losers? I mean, this is kind of a central fundamental question. And so it needs to be addressed either, and will be addressed either through the SJC or through legislative review. But this isn't a question that's going away. Municipalities still want the authority to pick who goes into their town. Is that the HCA process? Maybe not. Is it just through special permitting? If you meet all of the requirements, should you be allowed to open like any other business? I think those are the questions we're kind of grappling with.
I think when you add the medicalization or the medical piece to this, it's an entirely different animal. As opposed to having all sorts of governing bodies determining where dispensaries can open. There's no one really governing the medical piece aside from these same agencies that are governing the adult use piece. And nowhere else in medicine does that happen. It's very unusual, and I think it's detrimental to patients, frankly.
Well, you bring up a very important point there, Dr. Becker, that ties in with the bifurcated nature of licensing, right? So first, the dichotomy is between the local level licensing that applicants seeking a cannabis business have to get before they can get to the state level queue. And the state level queue is really where a lot of that equity priority comes in licensing. But then also there is this issue of these existing medical dispensaries and how they play into the picture. And anyone looking to find out more about this topic can look at Mass General Laws, Chapter 94G, Section 3, Subparagraph A, subsections 1 through 3, and you will find an extremely edifying, well, maybe not so edifying, but at least interesting run through of this whole debate. I do appreciate all the input there. I wanted to transition into a question I saw come up in chat that also has to do with some of the changes over the past few years involving outdoor cultivation of cannabis flower. Now, anyone who knows a lot about this issue will know that basically none of the flower cultivated outdoor in Massachusetts can get to market as flower because of microbial testing standards that basically make it impossible due to the environmental factors for that outdoor flower to get there. Last summer, in 2020, Yoko Ono submitted a citizen petition to the Cannabis Control Commission to request that the body take up a regulatory review, which is a process that is available to citizens around just this topic. And last month, the CCC actually brought it up at a meeting and committed to a working group. Noni, is there any updates you can give us on how that process played out and what you see going forward with those outdoor microbial testing standards?
Specific to that petition, I don't really have any updates on it, although I wish it the best of luck. we saw an early version of it at 4 Trees, and we're in total support of it. I think that there's a trend of common sense that we're all asking for, and that can also be applied to how outdoor grows are regulated for testing. So far as whether or not more outdoor grows will exist in Massachusetts, I sure hope so. There are a lot of farms here, a lot of farmers who would like to transition their crop into the cannabis industry. And I think it's also, you can definitely grow outdoor crops for the regulated cannabis industry. You might need to pivot to manufactured infused products as opposed to top shelf bud. But there's ways around it. I do hope that the petition goes through so that more outdoor operators can exist. Right now, it's very difficult to grow compliant outdoor crops in New England.
Any other input on outdoor testing standards?
I have a lot of input, Grant. So I agree with Noni. The CCC has actually moved the quickest on this than I've ever seen on anything else. Okay, it got announced. The working group got announced in February. They met with a lot of the outdoor cultivators, and then they reached out to the laboratories and had a discussion with us. I want to say about maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago. I do want to make it clear, though, Suhiko, when he initially put in that petition, he did not intend for it to be indoor versus outdoor. That has to be made very, very clear. He wanted the entire regulation to be looked at and to have a more common sense approach. He brought up the California testing standards, which in California, those regulators, the Bureau of Cannabis Control, basically determined we're going to make sure that there's no Shiga toxin producing E. coli, that there is no salmonella, and that there's no basically detection of the 4 main strains of Aspergillus, which would cause aspergillosis, right? So in California, operators are saying, well, we test moldy weed, run it through that system, and it passes. Of course it passes, because that mold or whatever you are observing as that mold is not Aspergillus, it is not salmonella, and it's not E. coli, right? You know, salmonella or E. coli are bacteria. So typically you're not going to see that, right? I think a more common sense approach, and this is what I alluded to in my talk, of targeted analytes with more mycotoxin testing. So Scott touched on this. I just want to explain what mycotoxins are. The prefix myco comes from the Greek mold. Toxins are obviously toxins. So when there is a outbreak of, let's say, E. coli, right? It's not the E. coli bacteria that is getting people ill. It's the Shiga toxin that's actually getting produced and then ingested. Toxins are extremely resilient. They're not gonna be destroyed as if the bacteria were gonna be destroyed. They're very heat resistant, sometimes chemical resistant. And so a more common sense approach to all adult use is something that MCR would really back. This is the list of things that would cause a relatively healthy individual. I'm not even talking immunocompromised. But Grant, I do want to caution in terms of, what Dr. Becker brought up. There is the risk of any medical program being enveloped by the adult use program. Washington 502 regs are the best example. Once the price points reach the same level, once the availability was the same at both, people didn't really need to feel like they needed a medical card because they can get the same products, right? And then we're actually not really focusing on those medical patients at all. We're focusing on a larger sort of market. And maybe the medical users can find some products in between that are going to be able to help them. If not, sorry, so I don't want that to happen, but there does need to be a system which allows these outdoor cultivators to not only exist, but to thrive. And the big reason is energy consumption. We need to come up with a more sustainable way to grow cannabis. Indoor cultivation is going to be a really, really tough sell for a lot of places who are looking to decrease the amount of consumption from the energy sector.
I don't want to change the trajectory of the discussion. If someone else has a comment on that, I do have some other comments to piggyback on what Jonathan just said. I'm sorry, Mr. Wani. Anybody else on that? Okay. So this morning I was on the session. I enjoyed hearing you speak, Mr. Wani, a lot about all the topics you were discussing. One of the things that you mentioned was industries that are relatable, and specifically you mentioned beer and food. which is, I actually had considered the alcohol industry as somewhat analogous, but I decided to go a different route after you mentioned that this morning. And please, I hope everyone understands, I am 100% in support of adult use cannabis. Bottom line. I do, however, think that medical cannabis patients are getting the short shrift. And the additional industry I'd like to suggest is the sort of mini Mart pharmacy industry. So, if let's say someone walks into, and I'm going to make this sort of broad, someone walks into, let's say CVS, and they pick up some product, they go to the clerk, they check out, they're done. Okay. They may make an impulse buy based on what they see, but in nowhere in that interaction is that clerk saying to this particular person, well, don't get that product, go get this product. If, however, they stop someone in the aisles and they say, oh, should I be taking Advil or Tylenol? That clerk will say, you need to go talk to the pharmacist. So they go over and talk to the pharmacist. If they come in with a prescription, they walk over to the pharmacist. The pharmacist says, do you know how to use this? Let me share some information. Nowhere in that process does the pharmacist say, your doctor doesn't know what they're talking about. Or, wow, your limit's so low, you should really talk to your doctor about this. The only thing they do is they support the physician. Sometimes if they have a question, they'll call, which is it's a symbiotic relationship, but nowhere does the physician get undermined. It happens consistently and constantly in having the medical dispensary housed within the recreational dispensary, and the clerk, the bud tenders, are doling out medical advice. I just had a piece published about this. They are practicing medicine without a license. And somewhere, somehow, I feel those things need to be separated. The medical industry needs to be able to prescribe prescriptions, and those prescriptions need to be adhered to by the I want to call them the pharmacy staff, but it's not a pharmacy staff, by the bud tenders without question. Or if they have a question, it's directed to the physician, not to the patient. I just had an email this morning from a young woman who said, well, you reduced my limit from 10 ounces. You know how much cannabis that is? 10 ounces to 2 ounces. Well, if you're using it the way we prescribed it, you don't need more than 2 ounces. And I could go on about this. Let me just open it up for other people and get off my soapbox for the moment. I'll get back on there, I promise.
Let me jump in with a question, Dr. Becker, because some made me think of the evolving advice I should say, I guess evolving is a good word, from the Massachusetts Medical Society. How do you think their change in stance over the past year will impact some of the proposals you were just talking about there?
I have to be honest, I don't know specifically what their change in stance was. However, I would like to just jump on with one other piece and talk about card mills, which is not what you asked at all, but I do want to share a piece about that. The card mills, as we call them, a lot of the, I can think of them by name because they solicit me all the time, but they call and they say, would you like to come and work with us? And I'll say to them, well, how are you not a card mill? And they'll explain to me, oh, we're not a card mill at all. We incentivize our physicians to, give cards to patients. So I'll say to them, well, what happens if I don't give them a card? Well, you're not paid. So if you came into my office and said, you know what, my knee is broken, and I looked at it and said, no, your knee is sprained, insurance would pay me, right? If via these card mills, you get on and you pay your $100 fee and the physician decides you should not be on cannabis for whatever reason, they're not paid. They're incentivized. There's a conflict of interest there to give out cards. And so that's another area that I think needs to be overseen. And I think the Mass Medical Society, the Board of Registration in Medicine, the physicians ourselves have been policing ourselves for a long time. This industry is very different.
Thank you, Dr. Becker. I actually just realized as I went to Google Mass Medical Society Updates Rules that we have the author of a piece about the updated rules with us. So Jess, what can you tell us about this update?
Yeah. So actually, the Mass Medical Society, as part of its most recent, I don't know if you call it regulations, but kind of rules, took what would seem to us as a very small step, but to them was a very big step, which is that they recognized cannabis as like a legitimate drug and wanted to treat it as they do any other drug. It was a conversation between the patient and the doctor, that it was focused on making the patient better over time. And so that might seem very basic for an industry that has had medical marijuana for a while, but for doctors, it was a tacit understanding that cannabis works in a medical capacity. And so I hope that opens the door to more physicians feeling comfortable prescribing cannabis. Often these conversations, especially with doctors that work in large medical centers, they happen kind of under the table. Like, you might want to look into medical cannabis. I can't recommend it to you, but it might help you, especially a lot of oncologists. I don't think we'll see a whole-scale change unless there's federal changes to the legality of cannabis, because that is what is preventing all of these hospitals from recommending cannabis. They take millions of dollars in federal funds. They do not want to jeopardize that money. And that's a huge roadblock because, I mean, the Massachusetts is known for its healthcare. We have incredible physicians in Massachusetts. Hundreds of them have their hands tied because they don't want to risk their grant funding, their institutional funding, their job. And so I think until federal laws change to recognize cannabis as legal, that will continue to be a roadblock. But I hope in the interim that the Mass Medical Society recognizing cannabis as a drug at least gives physicians more comfort that it is a viable medicine.
And just to sort of piggyback on that as well, one of the things that I recently wrote, I had a number of physicians contact me and say, "Well, pot's pot." Well, no, pot isn't pot. There are different ways to use pot. There are a bunch of different modalities, and it needs to be tailored to the particular patient. What you just said is absolutely true. Residencies are funded primarily federally. So, they could lose their residency programs. And that's a big problem.
And if I could just add to that, Dr. Becker, I don't know if you remember 2015, around that time, a lot of physicians who were prescribing cannabis were served notices effectively saying your license from the DEA to prescribe, scheduled drugs will be revoked if you continue to do this, right? And again, like Jessica alluded to, there does need to be change at the federal level. What I just read a few hours before coming onto this call was that the Biden administration's bringing up maybe we change it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. Schedule 2 includes cocaine, right? Where and people might want to say these are baby steps. No, I would say this is basically just something to get into the news. Oh, cannabis has been descheduled. Well, okay, it's been descheduled to Schedule 2. I do have a question for Dr. Becker, though, because we often get asked this question, and our response is, I'm sorry, you're going to need to speak with a medical professional because that's not what we are. So my question is, have you had conversations with patients where you have had to describe, or maybe Dr. Tischler's had to describe, that cannabis is not a panacea? Because a lot of people do believe that they can basically try cannabis once and it will alleviate all of these. So as a cure-all, while that might be the case anecdotally, I think the data will show that that's not the case. So have you had those conversations? And if so, how does that go about?
I have, and it doesn't go well. So I've had a couple of patients, one of whom has 4 different types of, he says they're different, I'm not so sure they are, types of cancer. And because of one of his types of cancer, he cannot use, inhaled cannabis. So we recommended, oral, edible cannabis. He doesn't like the way it makes him feel. And he's not willing to try a smaller dose, tolerate the side effects, as any medication is going to have side effects, in order to get to the place that it might help him with his symptoms. And people get very angry about that because, as you suggested, they expect they're going to come, they're going to get, a recommendation, they're going to be able to go take their medicine and it's going to cure everything. I think it's about education and setting their expectations and treating it, once again, as a medication. We all know that medications have side effects, and they have some work, some don't. And so when we treat it as a medication, the expectations are different. And something else that you just mentioned about the DEA numbers of physicians, I recently had somebody ask me about hot flashes, and I suggested, medical cannabis is great for hot flashes, and she said, "There's no recreational cannabis in my state, and I'm afraid to get a card because of her medical license." So if that's the way the medical doctors feel, they're certainly suggesting that or conveying that to their patients. Again, education and change.
Right, and the reason I asked you that, it was sort of a not a softball question, but I kind of was assuming what you were going to say. And the reason I asked is because my father's a doctor, and he was trained in the 60s and 70s. He's a neurologist. And every time I speak with him about it, the big things that he brings up are we don't have enough data. The reason we don't have enough data is because things always get kicked back and forth, whether it's FDA, DEA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, right? In terms of just delaying studies, we have no real pharmacokinetic or dynamic data in terms of what our bodies do to the chemicals we ingest from cannabis, phytocannabinoids, and what those cannabinoids do to our body, right? And you just mentioned that patient who can't have inhalables because of their condition, and then you suggested to do an edible. There is a metabolic breakdown of delta-9 THC into a completely separate cannabinoid, 11-hydroxy-THC. Anecdotally, we know it's more powerful, but we don't have any concrete evidence of that. Now, if we have enough anecdotal evidence, that is in and of itself a data set, right? But again, a lot of doctors, especially doctors who have been classically trained, right, who have not gone to DO school, who are, 50s, 60s, 70s, it's going to be very, very difficult without that information and data to get them to change their minds. And then again, my dad always says, and I hate having this discussion with him, well, Jonathan, cannabis is Schedule 1. Therefore, the federal government says it has no applicable medical use whatsoever, right? And we all know that that is just a farce and it's not real. But again, we need to empathize with those who need to be convinced. All of us are convinced, right? So it's how do we educate, like Dr. Becker said, the others who need to be influenced. And that's, a big role where Jessica comes in and all of the, journalists in terms of getting that correct information out in an objective manner, right?
I think we are moving forward in this way, though. I mean, McLean is doing some incredible research on cannabis, but it's also going to take private industry stepping up to the plate. To date, there are 0 licenses, even applications for a license for a researcher license in Massachusetts. I mean, that is a license category that is just begging to be used to make the case for cannabis, to make the case for medical cannabis, for recreational cannabis, to understand different, cannabinoid profiles and what they mean and what they do. But we're not moving forward in that way yet. So we're making incremental progress, I think, doing the research side of this, to your point. And there are pathways to do this further, but it's going to take people who are willing to put in the capital, apply for the license, and continue that research.
I do have a question on those research licenses, and I also want to stick on the medical topic because I have a question about deverticalization that I'd like to get to after that. But Jess, if you don't mind me asking, I cannot believe it just slipped my mind. What was the topic you had just mentioned? I got thinking about deverticalization.
About research?
Yes.
Licenses?
So I've done a lot of looking into and I'm sure Jonathan and his team will know a lot about this, about the rules for independent testing laboratories and the prohibitions for agents, associated persons, board members, and being related to marijuana companies that are getting tested. The research licenses, and I need to confirm this was in the final draft, I believe they have to be co-owned by a brick and mortar dispensary. And I'm just wondering what you think about tying them to brick and mortars in that way.
I mean, I haven't looked at the regulations specific to that, so I'm not sure. But if that is the case, on the one hand, it makes sense because you need to receive your cannabis from somewhere in order to test it. Right now, the way McLean's research works is often patients are bringing their own cannabis, and then McLean is studying the after effects. That's how they kind of get around the federal illegality of it, that they cannot provide cannabis. But that also opens up a whole host of problems when you're trying to do research and you don't have a consistent supply, dose, strain to all of your research subjects. So it makes sense from that capacity that you'd want to supply your cannabis from a singular place and eliminate some of those, pain points. But also that restricts people who are able to undertake this kind of research. It also makes it a very narrow market. So I'm not quite sure what the thinking was behind that. I can understand some of the reasoning. But I would hope, even if that is the case, that companies themselves, they can use this even as a marketing tool, that the research can help the industry wide, but also them to make the case about the strains that they have in the cannabis they're producing. So it's something that has languished. I think it's the only license category that has 0 applicants.
I just happened to take a peek at the chat and I see that someone is asking us about hospital use of cannabis. And I do know that a lot of patients suffer really bad side effects from postoperative opioid use, addiction being the least of them, but, small bowel ileus, not able to, anyways. Yes, I think if we could have cannabis in hospitals, that would be wonderful. And I've spoken to a number of physicians who think, yeah, that would be great. But most of them have some kind of federal funding, and that's not going to happen until cannabis becomes federally acceptable.
And also, I mean, nursing homes, we're talking about patients who are recovering from things, but also end of life care. Cannabis can be an incredible asset. And so we have progress we need to make in that regard as well.
Noni, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a little bit of insight from the attractiveness of a research license from a licensed applicant. It's very hard to explain to your investors, your prospective investors, what the revenue generating model is for a research license. I think that'll be a little easier to do when things are deschedulized and federally legal. But right now, I think that's just not attractive for a lot of different reasons. And the operators that are capable of attaching a research license to their dispensary are the bigger ones. Curaleaf, Commonwealth, things like that, bigger MSOs. So I just don't think we're there in Massachusetts right now to attack the research license, but I hope we are soon.
Yes, I think you probably are right there, unfortunately. But I know the commission begrudgingly is being pushed towards another regulatory update, but I imagine that's going to be at least an 18-month process. But on that topic, I wanted to swing back to the big distinction, at least in my eyes, between the adult use market and the medical market. I think it's important to remember that distinction. But right now, another distinction between those two markets is that the adult use market is deverticalized, which is to say every license type, cultivation, manufacturing, retail, delivery is a different license. And one entity can hold up to 3 retail, 3 manufacturing, 3 cultivation, 2 delivery, etc. Medical licenses are vertically integrated. They have been vertically integrated since 2012 when the companies had to be nonprofits. That nonprofit requirement was dropped, but they still had to be vertically integrated after the adult use law passed in 2016 and then was amended in the summer of 2017. There is a proposal on the table. Whether it can get through the CCC or not due to legal issues with license limits is debatable, but whether it happens through the CCC or the legislature, there's a proposal to deverticalize medical licenses. Shanel, I know that you're on the Cannabis Advisory Board, and this came up on one of the subcommittees last year. And one of the big discussions was around the fact that dating back to 2012, there's never been an equity or empowerment program for ownership of medical licenses of any kind. If they go forward with this deverticalization, there was talk of a 3 to 5 year priority period for EEs and SEs for those new licenses. What's going on there? Do you think they're going to move forward with it? And how big of a change would that be?
Absolutely. And I think that, Grant, you're 100% right. The fact that there was absolutely no diversity or, minority ownership in the medical was the entire genesis for the fight, in the adult use to make sure that that wasn't the case. And so absolutely, there's a huge desire from the equity community to be a part of the medical program. And I think that what you see is a lot of folks who have a medical desire being kind of forced into the adult use market because they don't have an opportunity. And, back to Dr. Becker's point, I think that, as the industry becomes more mature, that is going to be one of the distinguishing factors that puts certain dispensaries ahead of others, which is dispensaries that are deferential to doctors and that are actually treating people in more of a medical way, whether they're adult use or not, right? And when I say that there are some that are going to be treating people that way or kind of having a medical tilt to it, oftentimes that is because they were shut out of the medical, industry. And so absolutely we'll be fighting for a exclusivity period there. When it was brought up, we've been fighting to deverticalize medical from the beginning. Right. But with that comes the need to make sure that it doesn't further exacerbate, the inequities that we already see in the space. So that is always the challenge, right? Making sure that you are, balancing those, different interests. And then on top of that, balancing the preservation of the medical program in the face of the adult use program, which I think is also very important.
Yeah, Grant, if I could just add something real quick, and Noni probably said the most impactful thing, profit models, right? How are you going to go out and get, VC or private equity money if you do not have a revenue generating model where you can show what your investors are going to get, if they give you money? And what I'm worried about is what Shanel alluded to, and I know this for a fact, that she personally, along with many other members of the CAB, have been fighting against, the constant verticalization of the medical side of things. We're going to create barriers of entry that are so high in the medical market that people are going to say, you want to know what? I'm sorry, I want to do the right thing. I had an altruistic viewpoint, but I also have to make money. And it's much easier for me to go through the adult use recreational side of things than have to submit a full management and operations profile and detail everything that I'm going to do, where I don't even plan on producing any MIPS for 2 years, but the commission wants me to submit my entire operating profile, what my kitchen's going to look like, how many square feet, what products I'm going to make, all of this stuff, right? So again, barriers for entry, we should decrease them. For the medical side of things, we should not make it difficult for them to open up, because right now, what I'm worried that we're going down is that Washington model, where we're deprioritizing, and making it more difficult for these medical operators to exist. And they're going to say, screw it, I'm just going to go to the adult use side of things because it's easier and I'm going to make more money, right?
Which brings up another topic, which is access to care. We need to broaden the access to care for people who need medical cannabis but can't get an appointment with a cannabis specialist because it's not covered by insurance. And so this group of people is left out to go to the recreational market and not have any medical care whatsoever, except for what the bud tender who just smoked a joint in the back room suggests. Very frustrating.
Let me ask you, Dr. Becker, there were obviously changes during the last regulatory revision in the summer of 2020 in front of the CCC to remote certification. Commissioner Flanagan, who obviously is leaving at the end of the month, was very insistent that the first visit be in person and that initial visits from that point could be remote. But they did also say that disabled patients and people on SSDI can now go 2 years between appointments. So how do you look at all that? And do you think that remote access is important, especially for homebound patients like me?
That's a vital question, actually. Not only is it important for people who have trouble getting to an appointment, it's also really important to see a person in their own setting. So, a patient who seemingly is able to communicate, etc. If they have their caregiver with them, the caregiver can provide information that perhaps they can't. And we've seen, I've had consultations with people in different homes. So, a patient who wanted her son to understand what was happening, but he was in a different state, was able to get onto Zoom. It was the platform we used. And he could weigh in on her care. I think it's been incredibly important. Another piece that's important as well, I can't remember who mentioned it before, but about Boston. We've got wonderful hospitals and people coming in from all different states trying to get medical care, but they don't have a residency here. So that's been a change as well, so that people who are getting medical care now can, in fact, get their medicine here as well.
Yes, that is so true. Thank you for pointing that out. And to Commissioner Flanagan's credit, she was right in the middle of that. So praise for Commissioner Flanagan along with a critique, and I am sure she'll see that as a microcosm of our entire relationship. Where I will go from there is to one other question that I was actually debating with the chairman the other day, and which I'm hoping to get some of your perspectives on. And I think it also implicates sort of this changing nature of the market. Now, when Massachusetts rolled out its adult use market in 2017, there was an existing medical market, and a decision was made to give those existing medical operators licensing priority on par with economic empowerment applicants, which is the top level of licensing priority above even social equity applicants. Now, how that played out is that there's about a 50% activation rate from that RMD or medical dispensary priority to a final adult use license, whereas the activation rate of an economic empowerment status to a final license is about less than 5%. So other states like Virginia, Delaware, etc., are now having this debate about whether they should give priority for adult use licensing to existing medical operators. And maybe anyone who wants to weigh in, Jess, Shanel, John, Noni, Dr. Becker, where do you see that debate playing out, and what lessons did we learn in Massachusetts that you might want to give to other states on that topic?
Just look at what happened. That's the lesson. I mean, I think that a lot of times when it comes to cannabis policy, there's this thought that people don't really understand, or this is an opaque issue. It's like, no, people understand what's happening and they're fighting to get their piece of the big pie. And so I think that, when it came down to it, medical dispensaries had a huge part in question 4. In many ways they financed the operation, and through that they got their pieces in, and then they have incredible lobbying power, as we know as well. And so I think that certainly I would have preferred it to go another way. And I think that those are the lessons that we say to other activists and advocates in other states, which is, learn from what we did right, and even more so, learn from what we could have done better.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think there are 3 levers that kind of act simultaneously. You can have 2 of the 3. You can't have 3 simultaneously. And those things are the speed that you develop your market, the costs and the resources involved in it, and the equity component. And so if you could do it like Massachusetts, which focused on doing it quickly and doing it with few resources. And so what you've done there is kind of sacrifice the equity. I mean, not to say that the Cannabis Control Commission didn't try to implement things for equity, but it didn't provide the resources necessary that would have lifted up equity applicants to be able to compete against very large multi-state operators. So, we prioritized speed and low cost. If you want to prioritize speed and equity, you have to stand up systems to help people quickly. That includes things as mundane as proofreading applications. I mean, so many applications from equity applicants are getting stuck under this weeks-long review just because the name of their company is different in 2 different places on the application. That takes more work and more resources, more than has even been provided by the CCC through its social equity program. And if you want to do it, what were the 2 that I said? Speed, equity, quickly, cheap. If you want to do it cheaply and equitably, then it's going to take time. Then you sacrifice speed. Because it takes time for people to develop resources, to develop relationships where they might not have had them before. It takes time for people who maybe are, coming out of a drug conviction and trying to figure out, how do I move into this industry? They're not able to do that overnight. Whereas someone who is a venture capitalist, who's had years of experience, fundraising, has the connections already, can do it quickly. So I think depending on which you prioritize as you stand up different industries, that'll kind of dictate the outcome.
And I just want to throw one extra thing in there. Grant, you remember this, and I know Shanel's would have a lot to say on this. Right after Commissioner Doyle stepped down, there was a meeting, and I remember this very clearly because, Grant, I believe I was watching your cast of it on Facebook, okay, where Commissioner Title had the suggestion of, hey, we're finding all of these operators, okay, these large MSOs and stuff like that. We're taking this money and it's going somewhere. Why not use that money to help SEE applicants through the process? And Commissioners McBride and Flanagan almost bit her head off. I've never seen anything like this before in terms of the vitriol that Commissioner Title was receiving for simply suggesting, why don't we just use this money that we took from these operators and give it to these other operators that actually need it, right? So again, Jess, I hear what you're saying, but there does need to be a little bit more compulsion from the CCC to will this into existence, right? Talk is just that, right? So actions do speak louder than words a lot of times.
No, absolutely. And funding is a primary hurdle that we have yet to kind of address. I mean, that's another pending legislation to establish a statewide kind of resource. And even in certain municipalities, MSOs have tried to say, okay, we'll give money to equity applicants, and that has been viewed differently by different groups. So you're right. It's going to take resources. It's going to take people actually digging into their pockets and contributing to the problem. But it is going to take resources. We can't achieve equity quickly without them.
And I know we only have a few minutes left. I would like to make an important point here, which is that it was a mandate in state law that the cannabis excise tax revenue be spent on 5 specific categories, one of which was specifically communities disproportionately impacted by the drug war. Last year, there was $70.6 million in cannabis excise tax revenue on the adult use side in Massachusetts. $0 went to those communities. Now, this year, there is economic empowerment grants to the tune of $15 million in the budget, so that's at least something. But if the data from New Frontier Strategies, a Washington-based data analytics firm, is correct, and we're going to hit $100 million in excise tax revenue in the next few years per year, that $0 figure cannot continue. And so I think, Jess, you mentioned it, there is 2 different loan fund proposals. One is a loan fund where applicants would be able to get money from a fund up to 25% of the cannabis excise tax revenue, but it would have to come from matching private contributions first. Then there's another bill from Dave Rogers, who used to be the co-chair of the Cannabis Policy Committee, that would be a social equity trust fund where the tax money would go right in. But then the question is, how is it overseen, and then how does that play out? But I think, Jess, the biggest insight I took from your comment there, and it's so wonderful, is that you can only have 2 out of the 3: speed, equity, cheap, large number of resources, small. So we only have a few minutes left here, maybe a minute and a half. John, anyone really, closing thoughts? We probably don't have time to go around, but I'll just toss it to you, Jonathan, and please, or anyone else who'd like to leave a closing thought.
So again, Grant, thank you for moderating this. It's a joy to talk about these things with like-minded individuals and get some different perspectives. What I would say is, moving forward, the entire industry is going to be able to accomplish a lot more if we operate in a collaborative sense and utilize any avenue that we can to sort of get to the same place, because most operators want to get to the same place. They just want it to be equitable, right? And you're going to hear this word a lot in terms of equity and fairness. And I'm hoping more than anything that SJC or some legislative change is made so that these host community agreements are effectively not banished, but they're not viewed as some form of legal extortion. Other than that, I want to just thank everybody who came on the call to learn about something, and thank you to everybody else.
As a final thought, I just want to press that we need to move away from equality to equity. And I think that that's been the primary issue with the way that we've unfurled things for social equity and economic empowerment applicants. I mean, there's one social equity, for example, there's one front door into that program, but then everyone is treated the same within that program. Whereas, an applicant who comes in owning a house has a very different situation than someone who has 0 assets. And so I think if we take a renewed look at how we're addressing equity truly through an equity lens and not through an equality lens, we'll be able to lift up people who need the help the most and finally make some strides in that area.
My final thought is...
I'd love to...
Go ahead, Noni.
Do you want to go? Dr.
No, I'll after you.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. This has been great. I feel like I've learned a lot. I also did just want to plug mavirtualexpunge.com. We have a Corey clinic and an expungement event happening April 29th from 2 to 5. So you can register at mavirtualexpunge.com to meet with a pro bono attorney to go over your criminal offenses that can be expunged and sealed.
Wonderful. I want to thank everyone as well. I would like to advocate once again for the separation of medical from adult use and better access for people to be able to get medical cannabis. I know that Dr. Tischler works very hard on the Association of Cannabis Specialists trying to help advocate for that. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Well, Shanel, please.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks, MCR. This was such a pleasure. And we've definitely come a long way. And I just want to thank everyone for their fight for all of the different equity provisions. And I hope everybody's ready to gear up for social consumption, because I really kind of see that as the final frontier of, really having a full, comprehensive cannabis culture, here in Massachusetts. So, let's continue the good fight.
Yes, well, thank you so much. On behalf of myself, Grant Smith Ellis, all the panelists, I'll turn you all back over to Melissa with MCR Labs, and I'm honored to have had the chance to be with you all today as well.
Thank you all so much for being here. That is all the time we have for today, unfortunately. But I do really just want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for being here today and offering your thoughts and insights. It was very, very educational, so thank you very much. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope that you all enjoyed the presentations and the discussion. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us at MCR Labs via hello@MCR Labs or via any of our social channels, and we will put you in contact with these lovely panelists to get those questions answered for you. Thank you again. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.